So the second session here is on what I call the law of accumulation, or perhaps it's more simply put, to try to understand what the word capital means in Marx's most important work, Capital. In the first session, we dealt with, in a way, labour, but in particular how labour creates value and is the main source of value in a capitalist economy. So now we have to look at the question of capital, which Marx used to describe the whole system. He only used the word capitalist, I think, twice in all of his works. He tends to concentrate on the word capital. So let's have a look at that issue. What is capital? Well, let's remind ourselves of the process that took place under the capitalist process of production. So in this top line here, you can see that M stands for money. So a capitalist has the money. They start off with the money and they buy some commodities. C. What are those commodities? Well, those commodities are the means of production, which is the factories, the offices, the technology, and also the raw materials, and also labor power. That's you and me putting us to work in order to produce commodities and extra value. So we go into production, P, and out of that comes a new commodity. It's not the old commodity, it's not raw materials, it's not the factory. Money has now been converted into a commodity from the raw materials which existed in the means of production. But this commodity has more value, if capitalism is to work, than the original costs that have gone into production. So then that commodity is sold in the market and the capitalist ends up with M, but money again, but with more money. So through this process of going from money to purchasing commodities, production, selling a commodity, you get more money. And this is what Marx calls different forms of capital which exist. So we've got a system where capital is really a social relation linked to value creation by the labour power. So in mainstream economics, capital they refer to, and quite often we do ourselves, refers to factory. We mean the capital, the assets held by a company or owner of capital, machinery and so on. But Marx doesn't mean capital, he doesn't use the word capital like that. He wants to show that there's a whole process here of using labour to produce more money. So you start with some capital, with money form, and you finish up with money, more money. So capital is really a self-expansion of value, to use this phrase. We increase value through the process of exploiting labour, and we end up with more value, so capital increases. So capital can take many forms. It can take money in the form of money, it can take the form of commodities, and it can also take the form of credit. So not just money, but actually loans or bonds and other things, which actually Marx went on to call not just capital, but fictitious capital, because it's not real capital, it's not production, either in money terms that's realized or in any commodity, but it's sort of a title to expand production. So a capitalist starts with money, and capitalism starts with money. But where did money come from to start capitalist production? Because before, capitalist production hasn't always existed. There are other forms of production or of modes of production in society. So where did the money come from to get the capitalists going? Why some people got money and nobody else has got the money? So only those people with the money can actually start capitalist production. And what Marx says at the end of Capital, actually, is it's what he called primitive accumulation. So if money comes into the world with blood stain on one cheek, he says, capital comes in dripping from head to foot, from every pore with blood and dirt. It comes from the exploitation of what we now call the global south or the third world. It comes from other means of removing the property in the hands of other individuals, particularly peasantry and agricultural basis of society. And that's enough just sheer robbery and piracy. So capitalism emerges, Marx says, emerges. It doesn't just come from nowhere. It emerges from the first condition, he said, an accumulation in the hands of the class of capitalists of money that they get from capitalist farming. So instead of landowners just using the resources produced by their serfs, we start to get capitalist farming where capitalists actually produce things to sell on the market, grain, livestock, etc. And so money starts to accumulate in the hands of these agricultural capitalists. The second condition of this primitive or primary accumulation is through trade with other countries, merchants trading, starting with Christopher Columbus, if you like, and trading abroad, wars, carrying out wars, conquests of other lands, and usurping their lands and their resources, taking people into slavery, which is an accumulation which can be sold and bought, loot and plunder in general. This has been called accumulation by dispossession. So dispossessing everybody else who owns something, property or whatever it is, land, resources, taking that by a sheer robbery, war, and conquest. But the third condition is just the expropriation of the agricultural population, people who own small plots of land, small peasants, small farmers, back in the medieval times, through a process over some period of time of enclosing the land, throwing the peasants off the land, turning them into agricultural labourers rather than owners of that pieces of land through enclosure, and also the destruction of basic handicraft production. That's people at home producing things to sell on the market, so they own their own means of production, they do it from home, the destruction of that sort of production, so that the majority of people are forced to sell their own labour in order to live, and only a small minority then control the property and the means of production. This process takes some time, but these are the conditions which lay the basis for capitalists to have money and workers not to have money but have to work for a living. So he put all these three conditions together, if you like, in what he called primitive accumulation, but he was clear that, to quote, the expropriation of the agricultural producer of the peasant from the soil is the basis of the whole process. So the key to capitalism is to create, if you like, two main classes: a class of the owners of the means of production, and the rest, the class that has to sell their labour power to make a living. That division took place a long time in order to develop the point where capitalism becomes the dominant mode of production. It also took political struggle, revolution, civil wars to achieve it politically and sustain it. So that brings us back to the question, once you do have a capitalist process of production, what is this process of accumulation of capital? How does it work? Marx says that the key under capitalism, apart from exploiting workers in order to produce a surplus, which we saw in the first session, is competition against other capitalists to get a bigger share of the surplus that's being produced by the workers as a whole. So there's competition amongst capitalists, and that forced them to expand their production. We've seen in the first session different ways in which they can try and increase surplus value, but now they have to compete against other capitalists, so they're continually trying to find ways that they can accumulate more profit or be driven out of business by others who are more efficient, more effective, and gaining a share of the market. So each individual capitalist must increase their productivity of labour, lower their costs of production to keep their market share or improve it. So there's a scramble to reduce the cost of production. And that forces capitalists to look at ways of getting the productivity of labour out and getting the costs of production down, which primarily is through introducing new technology and new methods of production, which can reduce the cost of production and keep workers' wages to the minimum. So the disciplining force here is propelling capitalists to constantly accumulate. They can't stop. If they stop trying to accumulate more surplus value out of workers, then other capitalists will take their place and they'll be driven out of business. So as Marx said, the process becomes accumulation without stop. That's the Moses and the prophets. That's the commandments of capitalism, and there's no break from that. Industry gives the material, which therefore has to be accumulated and saved by the capitalists in order to reconvert into employing more workers again, employing technology again to boost surplus value. So yes, capitalists take a section of that value that they've created or profit they've got in order to have a good lifestyle and all the rest of it. But if they did just that, if they just used all the money for their own consumption, then accumulation would not be possible and the capitalist system would come to a halt. So accumulation has to continue. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Production for the sake of production. This was the formula which classical economics expressed as the historical mission of capitalism in its period of domination. So that's how capitalism is continually expanding the value, a self-expansion of value, and how capital is the dominant process in which this is involved. So under the law of accumulation, what the trend is, for the proportion of the economy devoted to investment in means of production, machinery, plant, raw materials is going to rise over a period of time, because that's the only way capitalism can compete against each other and expand value. And the part of surplus value that's consumed by capitalists, in yachts, in luxury living, and all the rest of it, has to be at a certain minimum, because otherwise there would not be enough capital to accumulate. So it must be reinvested in order to continue to feed the process of capitalist production. As Marx explained, competition subordinates every individual capitalist to the laws of capitalist production as external and coercive forces, and compels them to extend their capital so as to preserve it. You can only extend it by progressive accumulation. So he said, in a way, the capitalists are just as much prisoners of the system as workers are, although they live in luxury conditions for that. And the reason that they are, if you like, the prison or the jailers, but they are still part of the system and have to stay in the system in order to make it work. And there are two sorts of capital which capitalists must accumulate in order to continue this process. Marx broke them down into two parts. First of all, there's the investment in means of production, which Marx called constant capital. Why? Because the means of production, machine or raw material, don't create new value on their own, because a machine doesn't work unless workers put it to use. Raw materials stay as raw materials unless they're molded into something else. But they represent a certain value in the past, that value previously created to produce the machine, or previously created as a component in an auto factory or whatever, to be used by the factory process itself. So there's a certain level of value in that constant capital, but it's constant. It cannot be increased unless workers put it to use. The second sort of capital is what Marx called variable capital. This is human beings going to work, turning on the machines, using up the raw materials, and it's only human beings that create new value. So Marx said you have to distinguish that between investment in human labor power, which he called variable capital, because the value in that type of capital can vary. It creates new value. Only labor power creates new value, not the machinery which workers are using. They create, once the machines are working, they create new units of things, new commodities and so on, but only if human beings apply those machines so far. We haven't reached the point where robots do everything yet. Perhaps we can deal with that a little later. So the basis of the law of accumulation is that as capitalists spend more of their profits on means of production, the amount or the ratio of the value invested in means of production compared to the ratio invested in labor power employed tends to rise. This ratio Marx called the organic composition of capital. It's the law in capitalist economic expansion that the organic composition of capital will rise. So constant capital will rise as a ratio relative to variable capital over time historically. Is that true? Well, on the right-hand side of this screen, we can see a measurement by two economists going back to 1869 up to 2015 for the United States of the amount of fixed capital, that's factories, machinery, technology and so on, relative to per worker in constant dollars. So you can see there is a gradual and steady and inexorable increase in the organic composition of capital, the ratio of constant capital to variable capital. That's a key law, empirically verified, that Marx is presenting as the nature of capitalist production over time. What does that mean? Well, it also means, as Marx said, that the paradox of this law is the driving forward of machinery relative to labour in order to boost the productivity of labour. That means that the workers are more and more tied to machines and the working of the machine and the factory, clocking in, clocking off, making it tied to the machine to do various very limited processes in terms of labour process themselves. in a way, Marx said this distorts the worker into a fragment of the man. He's not, or woman, he's not creating themselves new things. They're degraded to the level of an appendage of a machine, and they're alienated really from the intellectual potentialities of the labour process. And as a result, because of the accumulation of capital, which is represented in the machinery, the factories and so on, a massive expenditure in that area, there's an increasing accumulation of wealth at one end and a level of minimum living standards at the other end between the owners of capital on the one hand and the owners of labour power on their own on the other hand. But the key thing about this accumulation of the organic composition of capital is that it leads at the same time to a relative decline in the demand for the labour power of workers relative to the demand to get more machines and more factories. So the tendency over a period of time could be that as technology is introduced, workers lose their jobs. Well, we know that's the case with new technology, new machinery as it comes in. So there tends to be a pressure on workers. They end up with a whole layer of workers, which Marx called an industrial reserve army, a layer of unemployed, available to work, but not being used by the capitalist system as a pool of workers that they can turn to if they need to. There's a big increase in production, or they can put onto the dole or out of work when there isn't. So a general law of capitalist accumulation is that the capitalist mode of production tends to produce both increasing wealth in the hands of the capitalists and increasing poverty for whole layers of workers, particularly those on very low wages and in recurring unemployment. So Marx says full employment doesn't and will not ever happen under the capitalist mode of production, except for very brief moments, but generally it won't happen because there's this technological bias towards investment in machinery and technology against investment in workers, and necessarily forced by capitalists competing against each other to boost the productivity of labour, reduce costs and get profits up. And as a result, there is a permanent industrial reserve army that develops under a capitalist economy of varying degrees and size depending on the state of the market. And this argument is not out of date. If you look at, there's a tendency to increase unemployment from technology, but on the other hand, technology also creates new jobs, so that there's a cyclical process here. Wages and employment will be regulated by the expansion and contraction of this unemployment group, and it corresponds to changes in the industrial cycle. And it's still with us. As Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, wrote in a report, if you substitute platforms for textile mills, machine learning for steam engines, Twitter for the telegraph, you have exactly the same dynamics as existed 150 years ago when Karl Marx was scribbling the Communist Manifesto. And it's true that Marx was a bit of a scribbler, so that is even more accurate in Carney's point. And if you look at the right-hand graph here, you can see in the recent period since the 1970s in the UK, the share in total production that goes to the labour force in wages and compensation has been declining from around 55% in 1970s down to 5 years ago about 50%. So there's no increase in the share that labour is getting from the increase in productivity and the increase in the accumulation of capital. Quite the reverse, there's a decline. And that is because with the new productivity coming in and the driving down of the cost of that machinery, then the capitalists will invest more and more in machinery. So we know that perhaps in the 1990s, the cost of a computer you could get then of the same power now was way higher than it is now. I'm working on a computer here which has the power of a mainframe computer in the 1970s, and yet it costs a very small proportion of what a mainframe computer costs then. So that's an indication that as new technology comes in and that capital gets, that investment gets cheaper and cheaper, there's more and more investment in it, still drives up the overall amount of constant capital, but it also means less and less workers, money going towards workers and jobs going towards workers. And of course, in the modern period, in this 21st century, we are expecting a complete takeover, that's the argument, of robots and artificial intelligence. The robots are coming, but of course they already are here in many industrial sectors of the economy now, not just in the advanced countries, but across the world, in auto factories and so on, but increasingly in all sorts of sectors of the economy. By robots, we mean a machine that doesn't require the use of a human being to touch it, to operate it. It operates itself, and it increasingly learns how to do things better through what is called machine learning. And it is expected by the next 10 years or 15 years or so that there will be more robots in the world, 8 billion units over the number of people in the world, which are 8 billion, which is 8 billion now in people just about now, and that will get up to about 8.5, and that's when there'll be more robots than human beings. Sounds a frightening thought, but I have good news for you, that robots don't last very long. On the whole, robots last only about 10 years, while those of you who are watching this session, I'm sure, are going to last 80 years or more. So human beings have a longer lasting, and therefore, in a way, in order to replace all the people, assuming that's possible, we're going to need not just 9 billion robots, but something like 100 billion robots before you can consider that they can replace workers over the period of the life of a worker. But you could say that is going to be coming. Will it mean more or less jobs? As I said earlier, it's an open question. It's not true to say that automatically means that everybody is going to be unemployed. It depends on the process and who controls the technology as well. And therefore, new technology creates new jobs to work that technology. Old technology gets thrown away and people lose their jobs there. The balance between the two is continually changing. Under capitalism, of course, the main task is to make more profit out of it, not to create more jobs or better conditions or less hours for people to work. It all depends on who's going to rule. As long as the means of production, and that will include robots, are owned by a few, the benefits of a robot society will accrue to the few. Whoever owns the capital will benefit as robots and artificial intelligence inevitably replace many jobs. But if the rewards of new technologies go largely to the very richest as they are at the moment, then we'd expect a really difficult situation to develop over the next generation. What we really want is a society, and we think that's what technology should produce, that such raises the productivity of labour sufficiently that we can reduce the hours of work and still have enough to feed and make a reasonable life. A truly wealthy nation, said Marx, is one where the working day is 6 rather than 12 hours. And real wealth is disposable time outside that needed in direct production for every individual and for the whole of society. Real wealth means less time for toil and more time for creative work, for what Marx called the free development of individualities, and hence not the reduction of necessary labour time so as to create more surplus value for the capitalists, but rather a general reduction of the necessary labour of society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific and development of individuals in the time set free and with means created for all of them. That is the prospect which all the technological development could be under a society which was not based on a capitalist mode of production. But instead, the capitalist mode of production and the law of accumulation tells us, far from it being that the resources and the technology of the world are going to be used to reduce our hours, to create better conditions for everybody, and raise the 8 billion people to the level of civilization. No, what's going to happen is an increasing concentration of capital in those that own those enterprises. So this is going to happen in two ways. First of all, concentration, that is, enterprises get bigger and bigger through the process of accumulation. So the small capitalist who has got a smaller number of workers is slowly going to be driven out of business by the big capitalists, either through merger or through patent control or through other means, primarily though through the economies of scale which a big capitalist multinational can organize against a smaller capitalist. So every new accumulation means an increasing mass of wealth that functions as capital and increases the concentration of that wealth in the hands of individual capitalists. I'm going to do a post in the next couple of weeks which brings that up to date, the facts and figures on how the concentration of capital is taking place and how that is the process that follows from the law of accumulation. But it's not just concentration of capital. Marx distinguished between concentration of capital and centralization of capital. That's where it's not a process of getting bigger factories or bigger economies of scale or bigger markets that are controlled by multinationals. It is also where a fewer and fewer number of companies control the whole of the economy. So we get the move from lots of small companies into bigger and bigger ones that control all the smaller ones. And so a few smaller ones control everybody else. The latest figures on that, or at least the figures which are most interesting to look at, is the ones I've got here at the bottom. You can see that this is from the Swiss Institute of Technology. They reckon that there's 147 tightly knit companies, they're all owning each other, held by each of them into a big super entity, and they control 40% of the world's corporate assets, 40% of the world's companies, if you like. The decision making of those 147 companies decides 40% of the decision making of the corporations in general. The Institute said if you take it out to just over 1,300 companies, they own the shares in the majority of the world's blue chip and manufacturing firms, the real economy, if you like, leaving aside banks. They represent 80% of global revenues, just 1,300 companies in the world. So that's how that centralization has already begun. This little graph, this little figure here is showing that right in the middle is where these big companies are and the interlocking connections they have, which the Swiss Institute is showing with all the others in the whole universe of companies as well. So we have, through the accumulation of capital, not only a reserve army of labor, not only increasing technology which threatens people's jobs, but also the concentration and centralization of capital in just the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people. Does that mean everything's going to one big monopoly? Well, Marx says, no, not really, because what will happen is that as those big companies become dominant in their sectors, what tends to happen in this process, unless it's completely crushed by these big companies, which is possible, is that new technology, newer businesses can appear and they will outstrip the old monopolies and start to replace them. That is the dynamic part of capitalism. It doesn't always work, but that is the dynamic part of capitalism, which is argued for by capitalists, that the new technology means new ventures, new processes that will increase the productivity of economies. And it's true that if you look at the top 500 companies in America and look at who they were, what they were 50 years ago and what they are now, you can see startling differences. Back then, it was big auto companies, big oil companies, big engineering companies 50 years ago. Now it's tech companies, the ones that we know about, social media companies, and so on. The things move around. But these modern companies that rule the roost now are even bigger, even more powerful than the ones 50 years ago. So the process is a continual balance between monopoly and competition under capitalism. But this drive to accumulate more capital, to get more profit, forces capitalism to go beyond national boundaries as well. It's not a question of just trying to control their own home market. They can't stop there because there's, as we will see in the third session, there's a pressure that's working on their profitability, which forces them to continually expand production beyond national boundaries and internationally. And thus we have the concept or the idea of imperialism, which started to be put forward by Marxists at the beginning of the 20th century. Lenin's book being one of the most important contributions to the understanding of imperialism, what he called the highest stage of capitalism, if you like, the next stage of capitalism, beyond just capital accumulation within one country, but as Marx and Engels said, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So when we saw that capital began by the robbery and the enslavement and the conquest of people around the world in the so-called global south and elsewhere, and the expropriation of land from the peasants at home. Now we've gone full circle. The capitalism, in order to develop further, needs to spill beyond national competition into international competition, leading to military rivalries for territory and power, what we see today, and leading to those major world wars that we had in the 20th century. So, to summarize, David, the law of accumulation. Over time, there will be a rise in the organic composition of capital. Just use the formula C for constant capital, V for variable capital. C over V rises over time, empirically proven. That rising C over V will tend to create a reserve army of labor and technological unemployment. It can be reduced at various times through fast expansion, through new industries coming on board, but on the whole, there is that continual pressure towards unemployment forced by a rising C over V. This size, as I say, the reserve army, as Marx called it, will vary cyclically depending on the strength of the economy, whether it's growing fast, whether the investment is taking place to suck up labor or not. And the law of accumulation tells us that there will be increasing centralization and concentration of capital worldwide as capital accumulates more capital and the smaller capitalists are eaten up by the larger capitalists. And it means the spread of capital globally to extract surplus value and sustain profitability through the whole expansion through the world of the major multinationals in the big advanced countries to exploit not only the labor of the rest of the world, but also to hold back and defeat the capitalists of the global south that are growing. And as I say, these things, the law of accumulation, can be and has been empirically verified in many studies. And although this session is not about the criticisms made about Marx's law of accumulation, both theoretically and empirically, I just want to explain the basics of it. This time, in another session maybe, we can go into the question of exactly how we can justify and support empirically the law of accumulation as Marx has spelled it out. And there is some reading, which I did send around earlier, for you guys if you want to continue to consider more about this law, particularly Marx's volume, chapter 25, and Hadas Tia's book, A People's Guide to Capitalism, for which chapter 5 again deals with capital accumulation, and my own book on Marx, chapter 2, which deals with it as well. All those you can find there on those references I've given you.